Yesterday we began a conversation which says that if you have a look at the parasha this week, is the story of the splitting of the sea and the destruction of the Egyptians at the sea. And as a result of that, you've got the song, Oz Yashir, the song that the Jewish people sang as praise to Hashem over the fact that He did this great miracle for them. And then the Haftarah that we read, and Haftarah is always supposed to match the parasha very closely. So the Haftarah that we read is the Haftarah of much later on in history, when the prophetess Devorah also sang a song of praise to Hashem. So the question we asked yesterday was, why would you have specifically the song of a woman as the Haftarah to match the parasha, which seems to be the song of men? And then we recognized that actually, guess what? If you have a look in the parasha, after the men completed their song, then Miriam specifically got all the women together, and they had musical instruments, which the men did not have, and they sang a song. And it's obviously that element of the parasha that is so important, and that plays such a big role, that's the part of the parasha that's reflected in the Haftarah. So that tells us that there's something unique about the song of the women that has an advantage even over the song of the men, and we need to understand what that is. So if you have a look at it, firstly, who led the song of the women after the men had completed? It was Miriam. In fact, it's very interesting because the Torah tells us that this is where Miriam, the prophetess, Dafka emphasizes that she was the prophetess and she was the sister of Aaron. That's the one who took the instruments, which alludes to the fact that she was already a prophetess when she was the sister of Aaron and not yet of Moshe, when she was a little girl. She was already a prophetess then. So Miriam's a very powerful individual who maybe doesn't get enough airtime, because I suppose Miriam is the oldest. Okay? So what's interesting over here is that she clearly plays a very big role and doesn't necessarily get as much limelight as perhaps she should get. So here's one of the examples of where she should get more limelight. Now, what's interesting about Miriam is how she got her name. And you'll excuse the pun, but I really think that if any of us had been given a name with the same background as she was given the name, we probably would have been quite bitter about it. That's actually what the name means. Miriam comes from the root mar, which means bitter. And the reason that she was given that name is because she was born at the point, remember, the Jews had already been in Egypt for years, for generations actually, before things began to turn. Because as long as the sons of Yaakov were still alive, the Jews were treated incredibly well. But it's after they passed away, Levi, who was the son that lived the longest, so after he passed away, that's when everything started to sour. And the Torah tells us that there was a new king that took over. And there's a debate in the Gemara if it really was a new king, or if it was just a king who now felt that he no longer had responsibility to the sons of Yaakov, and so he renewed his attitude, and he decided that now he was going to give the Jews a hard time, and that's when the slavery began. That's when life began to be bitter. As the Pasuk says, Vayimararu es chayehem ba'avodah kasha. They embittered our lives with a lot of hard work. And that's actually why we have maror at the Pesach Seder. When you get towards the end of the Seder, just before the part where you can start to eat. So we say, why do we eat matzah? Because the matzah reminds us of the fact that the bread couldn't rise. Why do we have maror? Because vayimararu es chayim, because they embittered our lives. And it's at that time that Miriam is born, around about that time. So her parents named her Miriam to represent how bitter life was. So it's quite interesting that Miriam should become an icon of celebrating the downfall of the Egyptians, because she was originally an icon of the power of the Egyptians and the suffering at the hands of the Egyptians. So one of the things about human psychology that you can see reflected in this story is that it's like when a person goes through difficulty, it's like an elastic band. So the more difficult life is, when there's relief, the more exhilarating the relief is. So it's all relative. A person who's had not so, Baruch Hashem, hasn't had a terrible life. So if things improve a little bit, okay, they might not necessarily appreciate what they have. But somebody who's been through a really rough period, and now things resolve, they're going to be dancing on the rooftops. So please God, tomorrow they come up with some kind of technology that nobody ever thought of before, and you can get rid of the coronavirus overnight, everybody will be so joyous. People will be so relieved because people right now are so down. So Miriam, who is the person who expresses how down the people were at the early stage of the slavery, so she becomes the one who represents the greatest simcha over the fact that they got out of the slavery. And that's why while Moshe sang, and it's a beautiful song, and it's part of our davening, Miriam didn't just sing, she got a whole group of people together, and they had musical instruments as well. So that's the first level, that it's relative, right? It's relative to how dark the darkness was. That's how much you appreciate the light. But that's specific to Miriam as an individual. The truth is you could take it one step further and deeper. Miriam sang distinctly separately from the men with her own celebration, but she sang with the other women. And in the same way as she represents going into the worst of the worst and then coming out and being completely on top of your game and celebrating that, the women felt the difficulties of Egypt in a more acute way than the men did. And that's quite important to know as well. Why? Why was it harder for the women than the men? I mean, ultimately, let's be real. The men were the ones who were at work. Does this not sound familiar? Does not sound like the classic argument that happens in every single household? Who has a more difficult time? The guy comes home and he says, "You don't understand how difficult it was in the office today. There was so much stress, and there was this issue that we had to deal with, and we had IT problems or whatever." And the woman says, "Oh, really? You think you had a tough day? You know what happened at home today? Do you understand how the kids behaved and how they didn't listen and how they were beating each other up and they broke this and they made a mess?" So there's this constant running debate often between fathers and mothers who has the more difficult time. Now in Egypt, who had the more difficult time? So on the face of it, all of the art that represents the Egyptian slavery always depicts the men as slaves, right? Am I right? That's all the pictures that you ever see. The men barebacked, crouched over, wearing some kind of funny thing on their head, being whipped. That's the iconic artwork that represents the slavery in Egypt. And so you wouldn't be faulted for thinking that the men are the ones who had a more difficult time during the slavery because they had to work really hard, and they did, and they had to work impossible circumstances. Firstly, they had to work, we don't know what their hours were, but you can assume it was not the 40-hour week. And you can assume that there was no workers' compensation and there was nothing in place for injuries or whatever. You can imagine what was going on over there, besides the fact that there were taskmasters and they were being beaten. And besides the fact that you're talking over here in Egypt, which is a pretty hot climate. So you can imagine that it was really difficult for them. And then, of course, there was the time after Moshe went to Paro where they changed the rules and then they stopped supplying them with the raw materials and they had to make everything from scratch. And then, of course, the Gemara tells us that Dafka, the environments that the Egyptians chose to build these big cities that the Jews were building, was all on very poor ground, very insecure ground. So you would build and build and build, and you'd get to a point where the project was really taking off, and then everything would collapse. And that's why the Torah calls them Orei Miskanos. Orei Miskanos, from the word misken. Misken in Hebrew today, it's like Nebuch, poor guy. Why misken? Because poor guy, you built something and it fell down. Or according to another version in the Gemara, it comes from the word misukan. It was dangerous. It was literally a dangerous work environment because you were in an environment that was unstable. So the men really seemed to have the raw end of the deal. What were the women doing during all of this time? They were at home, right? They were looking after their children and maybe making sure that there was something to eat when the fathers came home. What was so bad for the women? So if you have a look at the history of what happened at that time, we know that one of the big things that Pharaoh did was he had this paranoia about a child that was going to be born who would take the Jews out of Egypt. And because he was paranoid about it, he came up with all kinds of solutions that he believed would work to avoid this person actually making it. So the first step was that he instructed the Jewish midwives that as a boy is born, you have to kill the baby right there and then. Now think of the psychology of a mother who's expecting a baby. Yes, we know how the story panned out, and we know that the midwives did not kill those babies. But think of the psychology of a woman who's expecting a baby, knowing that the law of the country requires that baby to be killed if it's a boy. You know how much stress she must have gone through? Anyhow, that was for a relatively short period of time, because eventually Paro realized this is not working and the midwives are non-compliant, and he came up with a different system. What was the system? That he had teams of policemen hunting down and tracking. Just imagine, they had a registry, as you can well imagine, they had a registry of every single person in the Jewish community, and had a registry of every single pregnant woman in the whole of Egypt, including the Egyptian women, so that when somebody was due to have the baby, they'd send troops to the house. If the baby was a boy, they would take the baby and throw the baby to drown in the Nile. Now, what does that do to a mother? What does that do to those mothers who lost those babies? What does that do to those mothers who were afraid of when this might happen, that their baby would be detected and killed? Plus, we know that the Midrash tells us that when the Jews fell behind on their quota of how many bricks they were supposed to produce, then the Egyptians would go and they would nab babies and they would put them into the walls in the place of the bricks. Plus, we know that it says that the people called out to Hashem because of Pharaoh, and the Gemara tells us that the reason is because Pharaoh had the skin ailment, and he believed that bathing in the blood of babies would somehow cure it. So the Jewish babies, and for that matter Egyptian babies too, but the babies were being killed wholesale. So tell me, who had a more difficult time in the slavery? The men who were working back-breaking labor, which of course is incredibly difficult, but that doesn't really compare to the women who had this tremendous, the attachment of a woman to her child is unlike any other relationship that exists. So for women to have their babies taken from them and to have their babies murdered, they felt the bitterness of the exile far more acutely than the men did, because to them it was deeply personal. The men were broken in body and perhaps to an extent in spirit. The women were broken in soul. Their hearts were ripped out of them, if you think about it. So that's why when it comes to celebrating the downfall of the Egyptian nation, the women felt the celebration and the relief much more deeply than the men did. And so even though the Song of Miriam is shorter in words than the Song of Moshe, it's deeper and more profound in experience. And that's what the Haftarah is coming to teach us, that the experience of the women in the celebration of the downfall of Egypt is far, far deeper than the celebration of the men. So now we have to work out, what does that teach us in our world in contemporary terms? Because we get it in the history, but everything in the Torah is supposed to be a lesson for us. So we now have to work out, please God, from tomorrow, what's the lesson for us?